Hello and welcome to another edition of E-commerce Odyssey. Today I'm joined by Chloe Thomas, who of E-commerce MasterPlan. She's a podcast host, she is a speaker, and she's a writer. So in your own words, Chloe, what do you do?
Well, I describe myself these days as a podcast host and author because that's what I mainly do. Most of what I do is just speaking and writing. So what do? I host the E-commerce MasterPlan podcast, which is where I interview a retailer every week, and that's been going since 2015. And I also host the Keep Optimising podcast, which we launched last year, where each month we focus on a different marketing method, and each week I interview a different expert, a different angle of that. So we might do email, we might do Facebook ads, and it's all about growing an e-commerce store. And then over the last kind of 15 years or so, I've written 5 different books on e-commerce. So yeah, I like to do things that will help e-commerce business owners make better decisions about how to grow their business. And the two I've drilled down to over the best part of 2 decades is writing books and hosting podcasts.
So this is a bit off script because I didn't give you this question, but I mean, so obviously you've met a lot of e-commerce retailers, right? Is there a typical e-commerce retailer? Is there certain traits that you notice in them?
No.
Okay.
I suppose I find there's 2. There's the noisy and the quiet ones.
Okay.
So you get the noisy ones who love to tell you what they're doing. They'll show you what's going on behind the scenes. They probably they might have started their own podcast. They might be really keen and eager to get on stage and talk about what they're up to. So you got those who are out there talking about it, and they're really noisy. And then you've got the really quiet ones who assume everything they're doing is terrible, but it isn't, and who don't like to talk about it. And those are the 2 big differenents.
So was I on the noisy side of things because you interviewed me?
I would say you're more on the noisy side of things, yeah. But I suspect in e-commerce there's more of the quiet ones than there are of the noisy ones, because I think e-commerce is an industry that seems to attract people who like working in a barn in the Outer Hebrides, and I think those tend to be quiet people.
Because I think you've got, e-commerce is obviously there's the people who like the products and there's the people who like the technology. And I've always been more interested in technology, and I had to kind of learn about the products, and I find that bit quite hard. I'm actually almost perhaps a bit too much of an introvert, not so extrovert, to do e-commerce, because I just, I don't get out enough because of it. I don't get to talk to enough people, and that's why I do this podcast. One of the reasons I do this podcast. So tell me, how did you get started?
So e-commerce and retail was my escape route from banking. So when I finished uni, I was part of on the graduate scheme at Barclays Bank, and I applied to every marketing job going in order to leave Barclays Bank. And the first people to offer me a job was the marketing team at Pastimes, UK high street retailer that doesn't exist anymore, who at the time had, I think it was 120 stores, a thriving mail order operation, and also a website. This was in the early mid 2000s, and I was hired to look after the catalogue mailings as a direct marketer. Got very involved with the web, and after that there was no looking back. I was completely hooked in the world of e-commerce. From there I became head of e-commerce for a group of mail order businesses. Then I launched a marketing agency, sold that a few years ago, and now it's all about the podcast, really.
Mm-hmm. So what happened to Pastimes? Their overheads were too high, presumably?
Well, that's about 20 podcasts. That question. Basically, when I was there, I did 2 Christmases and it went under. Went into administration after the second Christmas I was there, which was, at that time, it was part of a larger group, and the other bits were sold and things happened, and Pastimes was left with the overheads of the whole group, and it was kind of probably inevitable. Look, this is looking back on it. Then it went through various other collapses, and now I think it might be a brand owned by WH Smiths, but I'm not entirely sure. But it basically lost track of what it was trying to do and got addicted to discounting. Right. So it was all about historically inspired products from different ages through time, and it became kind of a more tacky gift emporium where customers only came in to buy when we gave them 20% off. So
Right.
sales completely depended on which category we were taking 20% off. And it also, the other fundamental problem was that we were a business that was being driven by the catalogue. So all the we had two landings of new product a year, which was when the spring catalogue mailed and when the Christmas catalogue mailed. Yet we had 120 stores, a website, and a declining house list for our catalogue.
Mm-hmm.
But yet we were spending a huge amount on the catalogue, and the catalogue ran, everything was done. We were running as a catalogue business, but actually we were high street bricks and clicks business.
Mm-hmm.
So we should have had product coming in all the time. We should have been spending a lot less on catalogue mailings and more on store marketing.
Yeah.
So there are, like I said, it could be an entire podcast series of what not to do.
Okay.
But that's very easy to see looking back.
Yes, hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
I mean, the businesses that I've seen have gone bust. They basically, their overheads were too high because they, you have a shop and then you basically get it on a 10-year lease and you can't get rid of it. I mean, that's basically what happened to Mothercare, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the rent is a for any business. Rent is a difficult one, and I'm sure that came into the nuts and bolts of it. But if you're going for the big picture reasons, I would say that. But there were some amazing people working there, and I learnt a huge amount in my time at Pastimes.
Yeah. So basically you do a number of different things, right? So what do you describe yourself as like a writer, a podcaster, an e-commerce nerd? What's your what's your thing?
Podcasting is the thing I enjoy and I'm quite obsessed with currently.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's the I've always seemed to have straddled multiple worlds. So I've always been after I stopped working client side, I became an agency owner and an e-commerce specialist. So then you learn all about the agency business model, and you've got to kind of sit in these two camps. And then I was, trying to build a training business that didn't work. And now I kind of sit in the world of e-commerce and dabble a bit in the world of books and do a lot in the world of podcasting. And I know how e-commerce works, and podcasting is the thing I don't fully understand. And
so do you do? Because I'm interested in podcasting. I mean, one of the reasons I started the podcast was just it obviously quite easy to get going. Here we are recording this on Zoom, how is it that I mean, it seems that the kind of monetization of podcasting is something which isn't particularly well developed. And I listen to kind of things like Downstone's History Hit. He records all his own adverts, which must be a real pain. Because I mean, I think because Apple's just doing this thing where it's just beginning to like kind of develop some sort of network where people can, space on podcasts can be sold as like a kind of a media thing without it having to be a kind of one-to-one relationship. Do you have sponsors for your podcasts?
Yeah, we have sponsors for both podcasts. Yeah. And we do what you call a host read, which is where I read the ads. And the reason we do that is because it should create a greater response rate. So yeah, there's this whole world of kind of dynamic ad insertion, which has actually been going on for at least 5 years on different platforms that Apple and others are now trying to get into, and Spotify are trying to get into. And it's an interesting space, but for me, that feels, on that big platform side of things, it feels a bit more like the Google AdSense network.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a blogger, you chuck a widget up and you maybe earn a tenner a month, because you're allowing someone else to sell your ad space. So I think, I'm not sure it's going to be the big money spinner for people to make a living out of it.
So you think that with you, because presumably you have a strong relationship with the people you're advertising with, and you do a more bespoke job and you can get more money out of it than if you as an AdSense, you get a penny per click, or something. Okay, that's interesting.
I have no intention of doing that, but I'm hoping to use the same technology to monetize the back catalogue, because it was about 3 years of Ecommerce MasterPlan before the sponsorship side of it really took off. So I've got about 150 unsponsored episodes that still get listened to. So if I can use dynamic ad insertion to put ads across all of those, then that gives me something else to sell my sponsors.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating space.
Yeah, because I mean, I find, I don't know if, do you listen to The Bugle? That's my favorite podcast.
Oh, no, I haven't. I should write that one down and have a listen.
The Bugle, I don't know, it's hilarious. Andy Zaltzman, amazing. Anyway, I mean, they effectively, they get people to sponsor them. And they basically, you have a subscriber system. It's voluntary subscribers, but like Patreon, that seems to do quite well. And then you've got things like, I mean, Dan Snow's History Hit is clearly, and that's the podcast I listen to, which is the most clearly trying to monetize it. And they have a very long advert at the beginning and a very long advert in the middle. But then I've got my Apple Watch and I just buzz through it. So that
whole length of adverts thing is something I'm constantly juggling with, because, it's, you want the advert to be effective for the sponsor. So for there to be enough time to sell the product and give the call to action. So as it works for them, and so they come back and sponsor you again, because that's what pays for everything. But you also don't want the podcast, it to turn off the audience. I don't want someone to go, am I going to listen to Chloe's show, or am I going to listen to, I don't know, William's show? They're both about e-commerce. They're both interviewing an interesting retailer this week. I've only got time to listen to one on my commute. Who do I pick? Oh, he doesn't do ads, so I'll listen to his show. I want the ads to be sufficiently interesting and sufficiently unannoying that people will still listen to the show, because if they don't listen to the show, I can't sell it to the sponsors anyway. So it's something I rattle around in my head a lot, is how I structure the sponsorships. They give value to the sponsors and to the audience.
Yeah, because my one bit of advice here, because I listen to quite a lot of podcasts, is that some of them, like, Dan Snow's History Hit, he'll have the same advert for a number of weeks in a row, and it's very boring to listen to the same intonation, even like, of the advert. I mean, even just making it just a little bit different every week. And that's something that Andy Zaltzman from The Bugle used to do very well, because he used to read a funny advert every week with a bit of information. And it was just worth listening to that. I don't know, anyway. You're the expert.
There's a lot of movement now amongst certainly amongst the serious podcast sponsors. I don't know how far it's trickled down through the sponsor world yet, but into, rather than giving hosts a script to read, giving them key points and allowing them to put it into their own voice, because then you should get a better response. But that's quite a thing for a brand to do, is to go, do an advert for us, but do whatever you want, as long as you mention this, this, and this, and include the call to action. We don't mind.
I think that makes sense, because I think it's quite boring listening to the same advert again and again. Yeah. Even if it's just you recording the same thing. I mean, it's quite it really grates, because if you come back every week and listen to the same podcast, then oh no, so I think they're right. I think anything which is can make it more interesting. So do you find that, so you've got got a website, a podcast, the book. I mean, how do you think that they interact? How do they interact with each other?
There's the theory, and then there's the complete untrackability of the reality.
What do you think happens? What do you think happens?
Well, my hope is that people find the books on Amazon, because we're the latest one, e-commerce marketing, how to get traffic that buys, that one performs really well.
So I've got a copy here as well. I'd like to point out, very good.
It's interesting. Some people call it e-commerce marketing. Some people call it how to get traffic that buys. Interesting. But that one works really well on Amazon and appears for a lot of good e-commerce terms. Is a cross sell on a lot of good books. So I think people find that and hopefully get as far as the podcast pitch in the back, so we bring them in to listen to the podcast. We also run a virtual summit, which is all about email list growth, which again is to drive people to the podcasts. And the website. The website is an interesting one. I've always struggled to work out how many of the podcast listeners actually visit the website to interact with the content, or how much the website appears in SEO or appears, on social media as we talk about stuff to then drive people to the podcast. So I'm never quite sure which is the more powerful link, people listening to the podcast coming to the website, or people getting to the website learning about the podcast, and then listening. It's that one I haven't yet got my head around, but I think they probably go in both directions.
Okay. So do you find, I mean, because obviously there's Google, okay. So if you're launching a new podcast, effectively like me, right? Because I've done, this is my 10th or 11th, I can't remember. What advice would you give to someone who to advertise their podcast?
The first thing is consistency. So make sure the content's coming out same time every month, same time every week, so the audience knows what they're getting.
Oops. Yeah.
That's what everyone, it's the most annoying advice ever when you're creating a podcast, but that's what everyone recommends.
Okay, very sensible.
Second thing is make sure it's distributed everywhere, so that RSS feed is in all the right places. So it's feeding into Apple, it's feeding, correctly onto Google, that kind of thing. Excellent. And then it's about finding the way that works for getting your podcast out there in front of people. Now, I say trying to find, and I can't give you a recipe for this because it's really hard to track. Because a podcast is something you listen to usually on an iPhone or an Android phone. And because of the apps people are listening via, you can't take a cookie. If you run a Facebook ad for your podcast, you can't track that through to a play. You can track it to your website to then see if someone clicks on something or signs up to your emails, but you can't track it through to a play. And there's people who are trying to fix this, but it's really hard to do. If I look at my stats on my website, 80% plus of my website visitors are visiting my site on desktop. 80% plus of my email recipients are interacting on desktop, because my audience are sat at work when they're consuming my most of my stuff, visiting my website, reading the email. They're at work, they're on the computer, they're doing it via their work email, probably. That's what they're doing. When they're listening to my podcast, they're on their mobile. So not only have you got the fact it's really hard to track someone listening to a podcast and what led them to listen, it's also, in the case of my business, people are listening on their commute or when they're walking the dog, probably on their personal phone, probably on their personal Apple account or their personal Google account, in terms of how they're actually doing the listening. How they're receiving the rest of my stuff is on their work computer with their work email address. So you get this huge disconnect. So it's incredibly hard to track how the two work. Things which I'm 99% work well is announcing your show as it goes live on social media, on whatever platform you get the most engagement on. And the other one is going on other people's podcasts.
Right, okay.
Because then you're putting the fact you've got a podcast in front of people who are interested in podcasts about the subject you're creating a podcast about.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good advice, I think.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what about books? I mean, do you think people still read books?
From what I can tell, yes. This one is still shifting units, and it's been out for over 2 years now, or 18 months now. I think we've been published with this one, and it's still shifting units week in, week out, both here and in the States. When you look on the Kindle stats, you can see people are actually reading it. It's not just I'll put it on the bookcase and wait for it later. I also occasionally run a big event where I partner up with, say, 10, 15 other authors of marketing and business books, and we all reduce our book to 99 pence on Kindle. And we do a big 2-day event driving people to a landing page to buy, ideally, all the books. We get huge engagement with that. So I think there's certainly still a lot of purchasing of books. And from what I can see, I think there's a lot of reading of books too. So they're still very viable. Still a good way of learning.
Because I'm writing a book. Need to think about. I'll talk about that later. Okay, great. Okay, last question. What has inspired you recently?
Can I give you 2 answers for this?
You can, as many answers as you like.
Okay, so
you can be multiply inspired. You can be more inspired by other people.
In the podcasting world, I'm very inspired by Podcast Movement, which is the biggest podcasting conference, happens each year. It happened in Dallas, I think. No, Dallas is next. It happened somewhere in the States. I didn't go to the States for fairly obvious reasons. I watched it from here, but there were some amazing sessions and it's got me really fired up about podcasting. So that's got me really inspired at the moment. But in the e-commerce space, the things which get me inspired are talking to other people. It's about, my guests are always inspiring me. Fascinating, talking to the guests, but also taking the time to go to events and pay attention to events. I think I've fallen into a habit over the last 18 months, I suspect a lot of other people have, of signing up to events and thinking that counts. I've signed up, so it's all fine. It's like, no, if you think back to when we were doing the real world stuff, it wasn't just signing up. It was the going along, getting the time out of the office, committing to it. And I think that's something I'm trying to do more of as we go into the autumn this year.
I've always enjoyed these things more than I expect to. And normally I've stopped in, I don't know if you've been to a Channel Advisors event, which I have to say I think is reasonably awful and overpriced. But what I did enjoy, I think the last Channel Advisor I went to, I didn't bother going to any of the talks. I just talked to people in the just chatted to people about what they were doing, and I found that much more valuable. Because a lot of the time, these events, they try and they go, oh, we got this amazing big company. What's Walmart doing? What's Sports Direct doing, or something like that? And even if you're just if you're like a retailer like me, if you're a small retailer, I can't do what Sports Direct do. Can't even try. So to a certain extent, it's not interesting. But if I meet other people like me and find out what they're doing, then that is really valuable. So yeah, you're right. But it is, these days I'm because I don't leave the office so much, and because we used to all go for meetings all the time, but never do business without having a meeting with someone. But now you almost never do business with people you've met, and consequently, I just think, you realize how time-consuming these things are, and having a meeting takes half a day.
Yeah,
and I become more precious about my time, and so I start thinking, I haven't got the time to go to these things, but then I always really enjoy them. So
yeah, I think it's been really easy to get into the mindset of, well, I'm just not going to go to anything anymore because it's great to have so much time in the office, but I'm going to try and make sure I'm heading out to at least one a quarter, probably two a quarter of the big events, just because there's this term which I don't think I invented. I think I picked it up from someone else, which is osmosis learning, which they often talk about in the workplace with, junior employees are missing out because they don't get the osmosis learning of hearing a couple of people who are senior having a conversation. But it also goes for events. It's the stuff you pick up, you're walking past, you're not planning on going to a session, you walk past and it sounds really interesting, or if you're me, you desperately want to sit down, so you sneak into the back of a room to sit down to check who you're supposed to be talking to next and get hooked by a session. And I think that osmosis or the conversations are really important. So yeah, it's important to do them. So
there's wisdom. I'm getting wisdom here more than this is wisdom and inspiration. Chloe, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. We'll speak again soon, I hope.
Thanks, Trevor. It's been my pleasure too. Lovely chatting with you.
Okay.